Hello. I had such a good response when I mentioned that I was doing some training on executive function and why every speech and language therapist needed to know, that I thought I'd do a brief one to share. So we're going to understand what executive functions are, recognize how it impacts communication, understanding why it matters in speech and language therapy assessment, explore executive function, anxiety, trauma, burnout, and monotropism, and then consider practical implications for intervention and EHCPs. So a familiar scenario, certainly familiar for me anyway. You assess a child and you find variable language skills, inconsistent performance, difficulty answering questions, problems following instructions, poor narrative skills, social communication, slow processing. But on the standardized language scores, such as a KELF, they're coming out as average. But that's not what the child is telling you. That's not what school's telling you. It's not what parents telling you. So what's going on? And sometimes the missing piece is executive function. So what is it? Well, basically, it's a self-management system. It's an attention system. It's a planning system. It's an organization system. And when everything's working well, great. But it's a bit like an air traffic control system. So you have your executive function as the control tower, and then you have your language, your memory, your attention, emotions, and your social understanding as the planes that are around that airport. While the air traffic control is working well, it's going to be fine because everything will be able to work as it should. The aeroplanes will be able to fly where they should, take off, come in to land, no issues. But when executive function is affected, it means that information crashes into information, delays occur, and things become chaotic, just like they would if that air traffic control had a problem. And that example is actually Diamond. So what is executive function? Well, there are some core executive functions. So working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And then there are some higher order skills that go alongside that. So planning, organization, self-monitoring, emotional regulation, and problem solving. So as we all know, working memory is the ability to hold and manipulate information, following instructions, answering questions, remembering what someone's just said, understanding stories, taking notes, conversation. But if you have a problem with your working memory, this can look like a language disorder, even when language knowledge is intact. Inhibitory control. So that's the ability to stop saying the first thing that comes into your head, acting impulsively, becoming distracted. And it supports turn taking, listening, conversation, social judgment. Now, obviously, the first thing that comes into your mind when you see this is ADHD, but it is not just a problem in ADHD. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift attention, consider alternatives, adapt to change, see another perspective. And communication relies on this every day. So every conversation involves constant, rapid flexibility, even when it feels effortless. And again, what might come to mind here is autism, but it's not just a problem in autistic individuals. And what about this one? Well, this includes literal interpretation, one-sided conversations, difficulty understanding viewpoints, problems with inferencing, rigidity during discussion, distress when expectations change. Now, the thing is, language supports executive function. Executive function supports language. So neither develops in isolation. But we're not taught about it. So why should we care? What's it got to do with us? Well, if you think about managing emotions, processing sensory information, regulating attention, coping with anxiety, holding information in memory, we can't do those things, or even just one of those things. Think how that affects your language and your communication. And basically, many children can do something, but they cannot do it consistently. And why? Because executive functioning demands fluctuate. Now, this is particularly relevant for anybody who's neurodivergent, also those with selective mutism. Now, why do we need to know about executive function during the assessment? Well, what's really driving the presentation? Was this a language problem you saw? Or was it memory overload, anxiety, processing overload, poor attention, fatigue? And the child who says, I don't know, gives minimal answers, can't explain their thinking, forgets instructions, can't organise a narrative. Is that a language and communication issue? Or could they be struggling with executive function? So obviously, we need to know about executive function. And previously, it's been felt very much to be in the domain of the educational psychologists. But more and more, they're not looking at that. So I would say the only ones I see use it now are the independent educational psychologists, because for EHCPs now, they're not doing formal assessments on the children. They're talking to people, they're interviewing parents, hopefully. They're making their needs assessment based upon those things. They're not doing, the cognitive assessments or things that we would ordinarily see. So it means we need to know about it. So we use the brief 2 that has teacher questionnaires and parent questionnaires. Observation, that gives you quite a lot. Clinical interview. And obviously, if we're doing a dynamic assessment, then that's got to be one of the things that we're considering. And what we need to know about is anxiety changes everything. It directly impacts executive functioning. So when anxiety rises, working memory decreases, flexibility decreases, planning decreases, processing efficiency decreases, communication decreases. When we're anxious, we can't actually access the prefrontal cortex. The child has moved out of a sociability zone. It's not good. When the nervous system detects danger, the brain prioritizes survival rather than communication. When you're saving your life, you don't need to talk about it or have a conversation. What happens at this time? Well, they might lose their words. They might forget information, become rigid, shut down, stop talking, say, I don't know. But it's not always a language deficit. Trauma and executive function. So trauma changes how the brain allocates its resources too. Because when survival becomes the priority, executive function often suffers. I might say it always suffers, to be honest. Now, the thing about communication is it doesn't exist in isolation. And the effects of this will be reduced working memory, emotional dysregulation, hypervigilance, reduced flexibility, and difficulties organising your language. And this can often be mistaken for behavioural issues. So trauma-informed practice, instead of saying, what's wrong with this child, they would ask, what happened to this child? The other thing that we need to mention is burnout, which is a state of profound exhaustion resulting from chronic stress and demands exceeding capacity. If you want to know more about burnout, have a look at the work of Jodie Clark. So burnout and executive function. Well, working memory decreases, processing speed slows, organization collapses, planning becomes difficult, emotional regulation becomes harder. So many of the communication abilities may appear to regress in burnout. Again, speech, language, and communication is not a priority when you're in survival mode. So why does it matter? Well, children may score differently across settings, across days, across assessments, and burnout can dramatically alter the presentation, and we need to know about its effects. Monotropism, that's important too. And that's a theory describing attention in autism, where autistic children's interests pull them much more strongly than neurotypical people. It's harder to shift that attention, maybe to transition from what you were really enjoying doing. And how that can be explained is if you look at the picture on the left, that's neurotypical attention. So if you had a torch, it would be a nice wide beam. You'd be able to see all sorts of things. Monotropic attention would be a narrow but very powerful beam. And monotropism, so when attention is deeply engaged, switching that becomes much harder. And then that will affect flexibility. Task switching is going to be a problem. Transitioning is going to be a problem. Following new instructions is going to be a problem. Rapid topic shifting, listening while thinking, perspective taking, switching between speakers can all become very difficult in that moment. Might not be a problem the whole time, but if we're only looking in that moment, we're going to get a different picture. Why is it important? Well, a child may appear oppositional. They may appear to ignore questions. They appear to not transition by choice. But actually, their attention may be locked. So instead of refusing to answer your question, they're just locked in the moment. They probably can't hear your question. So how do all these concepts come together? Well, this isn't my term, but executive dysfunction may arise from neurodevelopmental differences and or be amplified by anxiety, trauma, burnout, and monotropic attention patterns. So a formula worth remembering is communication ability minus executive load minus anxiety minus sensory overload is actually the observed performance. And that's why scores fluctuate and why a single snapshot rarely tells the whole story. We can't ignore it because it is so important in helping us to understand a child or young person's language, to understand how they're using language, their social communication, how they're putting together narrative, conversation, and classroom participation. Now, lots of people have said, you're moving out of your lane. Somebody actually said, stay in your lane, woman, which was interesting. But the thing is, communication isn't in isolation. We have to know more to fully understand the picture in front of us. We're not diagnosing ADHD or diagnosing trauma or mental health disorders, but we absolutely need to understand how these factors affect communication to do our jobs. So a real life example, I met a brilliant example a couple of weeks ago. She came in here, she's doing gymnastics. She was sassy. When she relaxed, she was cheeky. She was funny. We actually had a whale of a time doing the assessment. I loved it. All her scores on the KELF were pretty average, sort of scale score 8, 25th percentile. Yet, reading the paperwork that came with her, she cannot access classroom teaching. She only goes into school for 3 hours a day. maybe spends 15 minutes in the classroom out of that time. She hasn't actually done any work since last February. She can't complete tasks. She can't organise her responses. She's pretty mute in school. So language testing alone does not explain the functional need. If I'd just written a report on what I'd seen in this room, it would have been glowing, fantastic, she's amazing. Only she's struggling massively because of her executive function. So the implications for real everyday life is that your functional communication will be affected. The executive demands are going to increase. Your anxiety impacts. The environmental demands are key. And it's going to have such a variable profile. So we have to remember, can't simply look at standard scores. Unfortunately, a parent didn't tell me that they'd already had an NHS assessment. The therapist was in touch yesterday, and we've both done a couple of the same subtests from KELF 5. But I said to her, it doesn't really matter because I'm not really interested in those scores. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, because I'm much more interested in how he is performing in real everyday situations and how his sensory processing, how his executive function, how his anxiety is having a major impact on his overall communication profile. So it doesn't matter if in the tribunal situation you say that my scores aren't valid, because I'm looking at so much more than that. Obviously, there's intervention implications if someone's struggling with their executive function. So lots and lots of visual scaffolding, reduce the working memory demands, chunk things, make them smaller, write them down. The predictability, if they know what's coming up, if they know what to expect. Processing time, the concept of asynchronous communication. Give them the question, then time to think about their response and let them respond however they want to. Written, spoken. AAC device. Give lots of written supports as long as obviously they can read. They're going to need support with their emotional literacy. They're going to go from 0 to 100 when they're really under pressure. And we need to do a lot of collaborative problem solving because we're not going to get the whole picture ourselves. We have to talk to parents. We have to talk to staff. We have to talk to the child because then we get the full picture. And that has implications for EHCPs too. So the executive function difficulties impacting the communication, the emotional regulation affecting the communication, difficulties organising the verbal information, reduced flexibility affecting the social communication. So we need to include these because these framings strengthen functional needs-led EHCP descriptions. And the key things that I want you to take away is that executive function is fundamental to communication. It influences every assessment we complete. It explains the variability and it helps us to understand real world functioning. Can't be separated from language. If we only assess language, we may miss why communication is breaking down. And understanding executive function helps us to understand the whole child. Communication doesn't happen in isolation. So staying in my lane. What lane? So those of you who are speech and language therapists, just think about, how does executive function show up in your caseload? How do you currently assess it, if you do? What changes might you make to your assessments and therefore your conclusions? Main takeaway message really is be curious before you conclude. So there's some references there for you to have a look at. Even more. Thank you very much for listening. You'll be pleased to know this is the basis of my next book. Thanks, everybody.